The printed floor plan of the one-bedroom unit at Shady Pines was tucked neatly inside a manila folder, resting beneath a stack of Warren's old college transcripts. I hadn't been searching for it. I was merely clearing the dust from the oak roll-top desk in the study, a desk I had polished every Tuesday for 34 years. My name, Lorraine, was written in the top right corner of the page in my husband Mitchell's heavy, blocky handwriting. Next to it was a date from last August, a week before our 35th wedding anniversary. Beneath the floor plan was a 3-page financial breakdown. The handwriting changed there. It was Warren's sharp, precise print. Warren, our eldest, who had inherited his father's pragmatism and none of my patience. The document detailed the projected sale of this house, the house my father had built with his own hands, the house I had inherited and spent my life maintaining on a school administrator's modest salary, while Mitchell's various business ventures evaporated our savings. According to Warren's calculations, the equity from the sale would be divided. 60% would go toward Warren and Cheryl's new home in the suburbs. 20% would go to Natalie to clear her outstanding credit card debt, and the remaining 20% would be locked into an annuity to cover my monthly care fees at Shady Pines. There was no column for Mitchell. I sat down in the swivel chair, the leather creaking softly under my weight. Through the window, the late autumn leaves were dropping from the maple tree, landing in silent heaps on the driveway. The house was cold. Mitchell always insisted on keeping the thermostat at 64 degrees to save on the heating bill, though he never hesitated to leave the garage door open while he puttered with his tools. I stared at the numbers. They had calculated my life down to a decimal point. They had decided that my independence had an expiration date, and that date was next spring. "Mom?" The voice came from the hallway, followed by the heavy, hurried footsteps of my daughter-in-law, Cheryl. She entered the study without knocking, a laundry basket balanced on her hip. She and Warren had been staying with us for the last 6 months while their new house was being built, or rather, as the document in my lap suggested, while they waited to sell mine. "Oh, there you are," Cheryl said, her eyes scanning the desk before landing on my face. She didn't look at the folder in my hands. To her, I was just a part of the room's geography, like the bookshelves or the faded armchair. "I was wondering if you've seen the blue detergent. I looked in the pantry, but there's only the lavender one. The lavender breaks Warren out in a rash." "It's on the top shelf behind the vinegar," I said. My voice sounded flat, even to my own ears, but Cheryl didn't notice. She never did. "Great, thanks." She turned to leave, then paused at the door, her fingers tapping against the plastic basket. "Also, Mitchell said he's bringing his friend Raymond over for dinner tonight. He wants to know if you can make that pot roast he likes, the one with the small red potatoes." "Raymond is coming?" I asked. "Yes. Mitchell said they have some business to go over, something about the estate." Cheryl gave a tight, polite smile, the kind she used when she was asking for a favor she believed she was entitled to. "I'd help, but I have a Zoom call with the decorator at 5. You don't mind, do you?" "No," I said, my fingers pressing lightly against the manila folder. "I don't mind." "You're a lifesaver," she said, already turning down the hall. I didn't move for several minutes. The house was quiet again, save for the distant hum of the washing machine. When you spend your entire life being the cushion that absorbs everyone else's falls, they eventually forget you have bones. They assume you are made of soft things, cotton, feathers, silence. They don't think about the structure underneath. They don't think about what happens when the cushion is removed, and they are forced to land on the hard ground they built themselves. I folded the paper back into the folder. I aligned the corners perfectly, ensuring the tab was straight. I slid it back under Warren's transcripts, exactly where I had found it. I stood up and went to the kitchen. The kitchen was my domain, or so they let me believe. Every tile had been scrubbed by my knees. Every cabinet door had been wiped down by my hands. I reached into the crisper drawer and pulled out the red potatoes. They were covered in a thin layer of dry earth. I held one in my palm, feeling its cool, heavy weight. I began to peel. Mitchell arrived at 5:30, his boots leaving dark, wet prints on the linoleum I had waxed yesterday. He didn't look at me as he tossed his keys onto the counter, right next to the cutting board where I was chopping celery. "Smells good," he said, reaching past me to grab a piece of raw carrot. He popped it into his mouth, his jaw working noisily. "Raymond will be here in 20 minutes. Make sure we use the good plates, Lorraine, not the chipped ones." "The good plates are in the dining room cabinet," I said, my knife moving rhythmically against the wooden board. Thump, thump, thump. "Well, get them out then," Mitchell said, adjusting his flannel shirt in the reflection of the microwave door. "We're going to be talking about some important stuff tonight. Family stuff. You might want to stay in the living room once dinner is done. Give us some space to look over the paperwork." "What paperwork?" I asked, my voice casual, light. Mitchell paused, his hand hovering over the cabinet handle. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flickered, a brief shadow of discomfort passing over his features. Then he smiled, his usual booming, confident grin returning. "Just some retirement planning, boring details. No need to worry your head about it." He patted my shoulder, 2 quick, dismissive taps, before walking down the hall toward the study. I looked down at the celery. The pieces were perfectly uniform, exactly the way Mitchell liked them. For 35 years, I had cut his vegetables this way because he complained if they were too large. I had ironed his shirts with starch because he liked the collars stiff. I had stayed up until midnight typing up his business proposals, correcting his spelling mistakes so his partners wouldn't think less of him. I had done it all because I believed that a family was a shared vessel. If one person worked to keep it afloat, everyone stayed dry. But they hadn't been building a vessel with me. They had been building a raft, and they had only saved enough timber for themselves. At 6 o'clock, the front door opened, and the cold draft from the hallway reached the kitchen. I heard Raymond's deep, gravelly laugh, followed by Warren's voice welcoming him. They went straight to the dining room, their chairs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I stayed in the kitchen, stirring the pot roast. The gravy was thick and dark, bubbling slowly on the stove. "Lorraine!" Mitchell called out from the dining room. "We're ready when you are." I didn't answer right away. I stood in the center of my kitchen, surrounded by the scent of a dinner I had spent 3 hours preparing for men who had already signed away the roof over my head. I picked up the heavy ceramic serving bowl. My hands were steady. There was no trembling, no sudden rush of anger. There was only a cold, quiet clarity that felt like winter settling into the marrow of my bones. I walked into the dining room. The dining room table was set with the gold-rimmed porcelain plates we had received as a wedding gift from my aunt. They were rarely used, kept behind glass in the cherry wood hutch that Mitchell's father had made. The wood had a deep, dark luster that only came from decades of lemon oil and elbow grease. My elbow grease. Raymond sat to Mitchell's right. He was a small, neat man with a mustache that looked like it had been trimmed with embroidery scissors. He was an estate lawyer, though Mitchell always referred to him as his insurance buddy. "Lorraine, this is magnificent," Raymond said as I set the heavy bowl of pot roast in the center of the table. He gave me a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've outdone yourself." "It's just the usual," Mitchell said, not looking up as he immediately reached for the serving spoon. He carved a massive portion of the beef onto his plate, leaving the smaller, leaner cuts for the rest of us. "Lorraine has the routine down to a science. Sit down, Lor. Get yourself some before Warren eats it all." Warren laughed, a dry, guttural sound. He was sitting next to Cheryl, his hand resting on the back of her chair. They looked like a couple in a real estate brochure, clean-cut, coordinated, and utterly vacant of any real warmth. "So, Raymond," Warren said, leaning forward and ignoring his plate for a moment, "the transition timeline we discussed last week, are we still looking at an April closing date for the market listings in this zip code?" The room went quiet for a beat. Raymond glanced at me, his fork hovering mid-air. He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound. "Well, Warren, there are several variables to consider. Market volatility, the prep work on the property itself." "The property is fine," Mitchell interrupted, his mouth full of beef. "Roof is only 10 years old. I patched the gutters myself last summer. It's turnkey. Right, Lorraine?" I was sitting at the foot of the table, my plate still empty. I looked at Mitchell, then at Warren, and finally at Cheryl, who was carefully cutting her meat into tiny, identical squares. "The roof was replaced 12 years ago, Mitchell," I said softly. "And the gutters still leak over the back porch. I had to put a bucket there last Tuesday." Mitchell frowned, his fork pausing. "Well, that's just a minor adjustment. No need to get bogged down in the weeds, Lor. The point is, the house is in good shape." "It's a beautiful house," Cheryl chimed in, her voice dripping with a rehearsed sweetness that set my teeth on edge. It's so much space for two people, especially with Mitchell's knees and all those stairs. I worry about you, Lorraine. Carrying those heavy laundry baskets up from the basement, it's a lot." She looked at me with wide, sympathetic eyes. It was a performance. I could see the calculation behind her pupils, the way she was measuring my reactions to see if I was buying the narrative of my own fragility. "I've been carrying the laundry up those stairs since before you were born, Cheryl," I said. My voice was calm, conversational. I took a small sip of my water. "My knees are perfectly fine." Warren shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "That's not the point, Mom. The point is efficiency. Why waste resources maintaining a 4-bedroom house when you could be living somewhere where everything is taken care of? No lawn to mow, no snow to shovel." "Your father hasn't shoveled the snow in 5 years, Warren," I replied. "We pay the neighbor's boy Toby $20 a week." "Exactly," Warren said, as if I had just proven his point. "It's an unnecessary expense. We're just trying to look out for you, both of you." He didn't look at me when he said both of you. His eyes were fixed on the salt shaker, his fingers tracing its silver cap. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the clinking of silverware against porcelain. I watched them eat. I watched the people I had clothed, fed, and comforted for decades discuss my displacement as if they were planning a minor logistics upgrade for a shipping company. It is a strange thing to realize that your family does not view you as a person, but as an obstacle that requires gentle, polite management. They didn't hate me. If they hated me, it would have been easier to handle. Hate is active. It requires energy. What they felt for me was far worse. It was a complete, sterile indifference. After dinner, Raymond left early, claiming he had an early morning deposition. Mitchell went to show him to the door, their hushed voices echoing in the drafty hallway. I began clearing the table. Cheryl immediately excused herself to take a call, disappearing upstairs with her phone pressed to her ear. Warren remained at the table, staring at his laptop screen. I carried a stack of plates into the kitchen. The water in the sink was hot, the soap bubbles rising in a thick white foam. I dipped a plate into the water, my fingers tracing the gold rim. "Mom?" I didn't turn around. I could hear Warren's soft, rubber-soled shoes on the linoleum behind me. "Yes, Warren?" "Look, about what we were talking about at dinner." He paused, leaning against the counter. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see his reflection in the dark kitchen window. He looked younger when he was trying to be manipulative, his face taking on the soft, defensive look he used to have when he got caught stealing cookies from the jar. "We just want you to be comfortable. The place Raymond showed us, Shady Pines, it's really nice. It has a garden. I know how much you love your tomatoes." "It's a 3-hour drive from here, Warren," I said, my back still turned to him as I scrubbed a fork. "It's near Natalie's apartment." "Well, yeah, Natalie can visit you more often." "Natalie hasn't visited me in 14 months, I said. "She only calls when her car insurance is due." Warren sighed, an irritated, impatient sound. "She's busy, Mom. Her job is demanding. But if you were closer, it would be easier. And honestly, the market is peak right now. If we don't list the house by March, we're going to lose out on a lot of equity. Equity that we need." Equity that we need. There it was. The truth, wrapped in the cheap paper of concern. He didn't say you need. He said we. "I see," I said. I rinsed the plate and set it in the drying rack. The water was starting to turn my skin red, but I didn't turn the cold tap. I wanted to feel the heat. I wanted to remember what it felt like to burn, even just a little. "Dad is on board with this," Warren added, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "He knows it's the right move. He's just, you know how he is. He doesn't like to deal with the emotional stuff, so I'm handling the paperwork." "You're a very good son, Warren," I said, finally turning to look at him. He blinked, taken aback by the comment. He searched my face for sarcasm, but I kept my expression perfectly blank, my eyes wide and vacant. After a moment, he smiled, visibly relieved. "Thanks, Mom. I just want what's best." He patted my arm, the same 2 quick, dismissive taps his father had given me earlier, and walked out of the kitchen. A few minutes later, Mitchell came into the kitchen. He had a thick blue folder under his arm. He didn't look at the clean dishes or the spotless counters. He placed the folder on the kitchen island right next to my damp dish towel. "Lorraine," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the jovial tone he had used with Raymond. I need you to sign a couple of things tomorrow morning before I head out to the hardware store. What is it, Mitchell? I asked. Just some updated paperwork for the house insurance, he said, not meeting my eyes as he turned toward the refrigerator to search for a beer. The policy is expiring. It's just a formality. I need your signature as the co-owner. I looked at the blue folder. The logo of Raymond's law firm was printed in silver foil on the front. Of course, I said softly. I'll look at it in the morning. Don't worry about looking at it, Mitchell said, cracking open a silver can. Just sign where the yellow sticky notes are. Save us both some time. He walked out, leaving the kitchen door swinging slowly behind him. I stood alone in the quiet. I reached out and touched the blue folder. It felt cold under my fingertips. The clock on the wall ticked, a steady, relentless sound that seemed to mark the exact speed at which my life was being dismantled. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. I already knew what was inside, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. The kitchen was coldest at dawn. I liked it best then, before the furnace kicked on with its familiar metallic rattle, and before the rest of the house began to demand things from me. I sat at the breakfast nook with a mug of black coffee. The blue folder lay closed before me. When I opened it, the smell of fresh ink and high-grade paper drifted up. These weren't insurance forms. The first page was titled Irrevocable Trust Agreement and Deed Transfer. It was 28 pages of dense legal language designed to sound dry and protective, but its purpose was singular. It transferred the ownership of this house and the small parcel of land it sat on from my sole name into a trust controlled jointly by Mitchell and Warren. There was also a second document, a durable power of attorney. It stated that in the event of my incapacity or cognitive decline, Warren would have absolute authority over my medical, financial, and personal decisions. The definition of decline was buried in a paragraph on page 14. It was incredibly broad, citing general frailty or the reasonable assessment of the co-trustees. They weren't waiting for me to grow old. They were building the cage while I was still standing. A mother's silence is often mistaken for ignorance, but it is actually the sound of her gathering the pieces before she decides which ones to keep. For years, I had ignored the small slights, the way they spoke about me in the third person while I was standing in the room, the way Mitchell had slowly moved all our joint funds into accounts I couldn't easily access. I had let it go because I believed peace was worth the price of my own erasure. I had been wrong. Peace without respect is just a slow, quiet surrender. At 7, the floorboards upstairs groaned. A few minutes later, Mitchell came down the stairs, his flannel shirt untucked, his hair sticking up in gray tufts. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, his eyes immediately darting to the blue folder on the table. "Morning," he muttered, heading for the coffee pot. "You signed those papers yet? I want to get them over to Raymond's office before the traffic gets bad." "Not yet," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "The print is very small, Mitchell. I couldn't find my reading glasses this morning. My eyes were too blurry." Mitchell paused, his cup halfway to his mouth. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, followed quickly by that forced, patient tone he used when he thought he was managing a difficult child. "Lorraine, it's just a standard insurance update. You don't need to read every line. I already told you, Raymond looked it over. It's fine." "I like to know what I'm signing," I said, keeping my voice gentle, slightly apologetic. My father always told me never to put my name to a document I hadn't read in the daylight. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He set his mug down on the counter with a sharp clack. Your father has been dead for 20 years, Lorraine, and things were different then. Now it's just a matter of clicking a button or signing a line. Warren took his own time to set this up for us. The least you can do is not make a production out of it. I'm not making a production, Mitchell. I'll just find my glasses after I get back from the pharmacy. I need to pick up your blood pressure medication anyway. He stared at me for a long moment, trying to read my face. But I had spent 35 years learning how to hide my thoughts behind a pleasant, cooperative smile. It was a mask he had helped me build, and now it was protecting me. Fine, he snapped, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. But have it done by the time I get back from the lumber yard at noon. Raymond is stopping by to pick them up. I'll do my best, I said. Once the sound of his truck faded down the driveway, I put on my coat. I didn't go to the local pharmacy first. Instead, I drove 15 miles out of town to the small brick building of the Valley Farmers Credit Union. My father had opened an account for me there when I was 18. It was a separate, quiet account that Mitchell had never paid attention to because it only held the small inheritance my father had left me. Money Mitchell had assumed I spent years ago on Warren's college tuition and Natalie's wedding. But I hadn't used that money. I had worked extra hours at the school district, taking on evening filing work and summer inventory projects to pay for those things, keeping my father's legacy untouched. The teller, Denise, was a woman my age with silver-rimmed glasses and a warm, tired face. She smiled when I walked up to the counter. "Lorraine, it's been a while. How are those joints of yours holding up in this damp weather?" "They're doing just fine, Denise," I said, passing her my identification. "I need to check the balance on my savings account, and I'd like to print out a history of any inquiries made on it over the last 6 months." Denise's fingers flew across the keyboard. Then she stopped. Her eyebrows knitted together as she stared at the screen. "That's strange," she murmured, lowering her voice. "Lorraine, did you authorize someone to call about this account recently? A young man? He had all your security information, your social, your date of birth." The air in the small bank lobby suddenly felt very thin. "When did he call, Denise?" "About 3 weeks ago," she said, looking at me with genuine concern. "He said he was your son Warren. He claimed you were, well, he said you were having some memory issues and that he was taking over your financial affairs. He wanted to know the exact balance and how to transfer the funds to a joint trust account." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him we couldn't release that information or make any changes without a certified power of attorney or your physical presence in the branch," Denise said. "He got quite upset. He said it was an emergency." I felt a cold drop of sweat trace its way down my spine. They hadn't just planned my future. They were already trying to access my past. "Denise," I said, my voice remarkably steady, "I want to close this account today. I want the entire balance transferred to a new account under a different name with a completely new security protocol. And I want to set up a safety deposit box today." "Of course," Denise said, her face hardening into a look of quiet solidarity. She didn't ask questions. Women of our age don't need to ask questions to understand when another woman is quietly fighting for her life. "Let's get the paperwork started." When I drove back into our driveway 2 hours later, the sky had turned the color of wet slate. Mitchell's truck wasn't back yet, but Warren's car was parked near the garage. I walked into the kitchen, carrying the small white paper bag from the pharmacy. The blue folder was still sitting on the island, but someone had moved it. It was now open to the signature page, with a bright yellow stick-on arrow pointing to the line marked Lorraine Vance, co-owner. Next to the folder was a small, handwritten note from Warren. "Mom, Dad said you couldn't find your glasses. I left a pair of mine on the counter. Please sign this before 12 o'clock. We're on a tight schedule." I looked at his glasses, a cheap plastic pair of readers. Then I looked at the yellow arrow. They were waiting for me to sign my own eviction. I picked up the blue folder, closed it slowly, and slid it into my canvas grocery bag, right beneath Mitchell's heart medication. The kitchen was filled with the warm, savory scent of chicken broth when the back door opened. Mitchell and Warren walked in together, their boots thudding in unison on the linoleum. They brought the smell of cold cedar and diesel exhaust with them. Mitchell didn't take off his coat. He went straight to the kitchen island, his eyes scanning the empty counter where the blue folder had been. "Lorraine," he said, his voice dropping into a lower register, the one he used when he was trying to establish authority. "Where are the papers?" I was standing at the stove, gently stirring the soup. "They're in a safe place, Mitchell." Warren took a step forward, his brow furrowed, his phone already in his hand. "What does that mean, Mom? Raymond's paralegal is supposed to meet us here in 15 minutes to notarize your signature. We're on a deadline with the title company." "Then you'll have to miss your deadline," I said, turning off the burner. I turned around to face them, resting my hands on the edge of the counter. "I'm not signing them." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Mitchell stared at me as if I had suddenly spoken in a foreign language. Warren's jaw worked silently, his fingers tightening around his phone. "What do you mean you're not signing?" Mitchell's voice rose, the performative patience finally cracking. "We've been planning this for months, Lorraine. We discussed the whole thing back in August at Natalie's birthday dinner. You said you were tired of the upkeep. You said you wanted to simplify." I looked at him, letting my gaze hold his until he looked away, pretending to check his watch. "I said I was tired of cleaning the gutters while you watched television, Mitchell," I said softly. "I never said I wanted to sign over my father's house to a trust I have no control over." Warren stepped in, his voice taking on a sharp, clinical tone that made my stomach turn. "Mom, this is exactly what we were talking about. You're getting confused. We had a detailed conversation about this. You agreed that putting the house in a trust was the best way to protect your assets. If you're having trouble remembering that, maybe we need to schedule an appointment with Dr. Evans." It was a cold, calculated move. They wanted me to believe my mind was failing, because it was easier than admitting their own hearts had already failed. If they could make me doubt my own memory, they wouldn't have to feel guilty about taking everything I had. "My memory is perfectly fine, Warren," I said, looking directly at my son. "In fact, it's remarkably clear. I remember 3 weeks ago when you called the credit union, pretending to be my financial representative. I remember you telling Denise that I was suffering from cognitive decline, so you could get your hands on my savings." Warren's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Mitchell, expecting his father to rescue him, But Mitchell was staring at the floor. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "You had no right to go behind my back," I said, my voice remaining calm, steady, and quiet. "And you have no right to this house." "This house is family property," Mitchell snapped, his voice booming in the small kitchen. "I've lived here for 35 years, Lorraine. I paid for the new furnace. I paid for the siding." "You paid for them with the money I lent your business in 2012, Mitchell," I said. "The $60,000 from my father's estate that you swore you would pay back within 2 years. I still have the promissory note. It's signed by you, and it was drafted by a lawyer who wasn't Raymond." Mitchell's mouth opened slightly. The anger in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, naked fear. He had forgotten about the note. Or, more likely, he had assumed I had lost it, or that after so many years of silence, I would never have the courage to use it. Before either of them could reply, the landline on the wall began to ring. The shrill, old-fashioned bell seemed incredibly loud in the tense silence of the kitchen. I walked over and picked up the receiver. "Hello? Mom?" Natalie's voice came through the line, high-pitched and instantly defensive. "Mom, what is going on? Warren just texted me. He says you're refusing to sign the trust papers. He says you're ruining everything." "Hello, Natalie," I said, leaning against the wall. "How is the weather in this city?" "Mom, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice taking on that familiar, whiny quality she had used since she was a teenager to get her way. "We need this sale to go through. If Warren doesn't get his share of the equity, he can't co-sign on my consolidation loan. My interest rates are eating me alive, Mom. I can't sleep. I'm having panic attacks. You always said you wanted us to be secure." "I did want you to be secure, Natalie," I said, watching Mitchell and Warren exchange whispered, frantic words across the kitchen island. "But I didn't realize my security had to be sacrificed for yours. Tell me, Natalie, did you know they were planning to put me in Shady Pines by April?" There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Mom, it's a really nice place," she stammered, her voice losing its confidence. We thought you'd be lonely here once Warren and Cheryl moved out. We were trying to plan ahead." "You were planning a life without me, Natalie," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper, "and you were using my money to pay for it." "Mom, that's not—" "I have to go, Natalie. My soup is boiling over." I hung up the receiver, placing it gently back on its cradle. I turned back to Mitchell and Warren. They were both watching me now, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. They were no longer the benevolent caretakers managing an aging relative. They were two men who had been caught in a drafty room with the lights suddenly turned on. "Raymond is coming tomorrow morning at 9, Mitchell said, his voice tight, his fists clenched in his coat pockets. "With a notary. We're going to sit down and we're going to resolve this, Lorraine, one way or another. I won't have you destroying this family over a few old papers." "I'm not destroying this family, Mitchell," I said, walking past them to the sink to wash my hands. "I'm just stopped holding it up." They left the kitchen without eating the soup. I heard the front door slam, followed by the sound of Warren's car roaring down the driveway. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. I looked out the window at the dark, barren branches of the maple tree. The cold morning light was fading fast, leaving behind a heavy gray twilight. I went up to my bedroom and locked the door. I reached into my canvas bag, pulled out the blue folder, and placed it inside the small metal lockbox under my bed, alongside the promissory note from 2012. They thought tomorrow morning at 9 was the end of the game. They didn't realize it was only the beginning. The silence that settled over the house that evening was different from the usual quiet. Usually the house was filled with the gentle domestic hum of my presence, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the vacuum, the soft rustle of laundry being folded. It was a white noise that the family consumed without noticing, a background frequency that kept them warm and comfortable. Tonight, I turned that frequency off. At 7 o'clock, I was sitting in the armchair in my bedroom, a book open in my lap, though I wasn't reading. Downstairs, the kitchen remained dark. There was no smell of roasting garlic or simmering sauce. Around 7:30, there was a soft, hesitant knock on my door. "Lorraine?" Cheryl's voice was tentative, stripped of its usual breezy confidence. "Yes, Cheryl?" I didn't get up. The door opened a few inches. Cheryl stood in the hallway, the dim light catching the nervous tuck of her chin. We were just wondering about dinner. Warren has a headache, and we didn't see anything on the stove." "There is leftover chicken soup in the refrigerator, Cheryl," I said, not looking up from my book. "You'll need to heat it up yourself. And please make sure to wash the pot and wipe down the stove when you're finished. I've already cleaned the kitchen for the night." Cheryl blinked, her mouth opening slightly. For a second, she looked like she wanted to argue, to point out that she was a guest or that Warren was tired. But the cold, flat level of my gaze stopped her. "Oh," she said, her voice dropping. "Okay, I guess I can do that." "Thank you," I said, and turned the page of my book. When you stop performing the rituals that keep everyone comfortable, you realize how much of their love was actually just gratitude for your compliance. They didn't miss my company. They missed my labor. They didn't want to talk to me. They wanted me to feed them. Below me, I heard the faint, clumsy sounds of Cheryl navigating my kitchen. A pot clattered against the sink. The microwave beeped 3 times. It was a strange, small satisfaction to realize that without my invisible coordination, even the simple act of warming soup became a clumsy obstacle for them. At 9 o'clock, I picked up the bedside phone. I didn't call Natalie, and I didn't call Warren. I dialed a number I had looked up in the directory earlier that afternoon. "Sylvia?" I said when the line connected. "Lorraine?" Sylvia Albright's voice was sharp, alert. She was a semi-retired estate attorney who had handled the retirement seminars for the school district where I used to work. We had eaten lunch together in the staff room once a month for 10 years. She was a woman who knew the law like the back of her hand and had no patience for men who treated women like inventory. "I need a favor, Sylvia," I said, "and I need you to be professional about it." "Name it," she said, her tone instantly shifting into business mode. "My husband and son have drafted a trust agreement. They want me to sign over my father's house tomorrow morning at 9. They have their own lawyer, Raymond Vance, coming to notarize it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of papers as Sylvia adjusted her headset. "Raymond Vance? Mitchell's golf partner?" "The same." Lorraine, that is a massive conflict of interest, Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a hard, protective register. If Raymond is representing Mitchell and Warren, and he's presenting you with a document that strips you of your sole asset without advising you to seek independent counsel, he's committing a serious ethical violation. The State Bar Association takes a very dim view of that, especially when it involves an older client. I know, I said. That's why I want you here tomorrow morning at 8:45. I'll be there at 8:30, Sylvia said. Do you have a copy of the document? I do. It's in a safe place. Don't sign anything, Lorraine. Don't even write your initials on a scrap of paper until I've read every single word. I don't intend to, I said. Thank you, Sylvia. Get some sleep, Lor. Let me handle the heavy lifting tomorrow. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. The house was cold, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to go downstairs and adjust the thermostat. I let them be cold. At midnight, I went downstairs to get a glass of water. The kitchen was dark, save for the pale, bluish glow of the open refrigerator door. Mitchell was standing there, holding a slice of cold American cheese, his face illuminated by the harsh, artificial light. He looked older than 65. His shoulders were stooped, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't look at me when I entered, but he didn't close the refrigerator either. "You're going to ruin everything, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and self-pity. "Warren's house, Natalie's debt, my peace of mind. You're just going to throw 35 years of marriage in the trash because of a grudge." I filled my glass from the tap, the sound of the water loud in the silent room. "I didn't throw our marriage in the trash, Mitchell," I said, turning to look at him. "You did. You just expected me to keep cleaning up the mess so you wouldn't have to look at it." "I made mistakes," he muttered, swallowing the cheese. "But we're a family, Lorraine. We're supposed to protect each other." "Who was protecting me, Mitchell?" I asked. My voice was very quiet, very steady. "When you and Warren were sitting in Raymond's office 3 months ago, drafting a document to put me in an assisted living facility 3 hours away so Warren could buy a bigger house, who was protecting me then?" Mitchell froze. The blue light from the refrigerator caught the sudden, guilt-ridden twitch in his jaw. He didn't answer. He couldn't. "Go to bed, Mitchell," I said, taking my glass of water. "You have a big day tomorrow." I walked back up the stairs in the dark, my steps light and deliberate. Behind me, I heard the heavy, defeated click of the refrigerator door closing, plunging the kitchen back into absolute darkness. By 8:25, the rain had started. It was a cold, driving sleet that drummed against the dining room windows, blurring the view of the bare maple trees outside. I sat at the head of the dining table, dressed in a charcoal wool skirt and a cream-colored silk blouse I usually save for funerals or autumn weddings. I had my hair pulled back neatly, my face lightly powdered. I wanted to look like the woman I was, the woman who had managed the budgets of 3 different elementary schools, who had coordinated bus routes and staff payrolls while Mitchell was losing our savings in a string of failed logistics companies. Mitchell and Warren came down the stairs together. They were both wearing their good sports coats, though neither had tied a tie. They had the stiff, nervous posture of men who believed they were about to perform a difficult but necessary chore. "You're up early," Mitchell said, his eyes scanning the table. The blue folder was sitting right in front of my chair. "Good, let's get this done. Raymond should be here any minute." Before I could answer, the gravel in the driveway crunched. A pair of headlights swept across the dining room wall. "That'll be him," Warren said, moving toward the front door. But it wasn't Raymond. When Warren opened the door, Sylvia Albright stepped into the foyer. She wore a dark beige trench coat, leather gloves, and carried a worn, professional briefcase that looked heavy enough to crack pavement. She was 70, with a cap of silver hair and eyes that had seen every trick a desperate man could pull in a probate court. "Sylvia?" Mitchell said, coming out of the dining room, his face blank with confusion. "What are you doing here?" "Good morning, Mitchell," Sylvia said, pulling off her gloves finger by finger. "Lorraine asked me to stop by. I'm acting as her legal counsel this morning." Warren's face hardened. He stepped into Sylvia's path, his voice rising a fraction. "This is a private family matter, Mrs. Albright. We don't need a lawyer here. We're just signing some insurance and trust updates." "If it's a trust update involving the transfer of real property, Warren, then it is by definition a legal matter," Sylvia said, her voice smooth and completely unbothered by his posturing. She walked past him as if he were nothing more than a coat rack and entered the dining room. She pulled out the chair to my left and sat down. "And since your mother is the sole owner of this property, she is entitled to independent representation. Now, where is Raymond? He's usually late when it rains." At that exact moment, the doorbell rang again. Raymond Vance entered the house with a wet umbrella and a wide, performative grin. He was carrying his leather notary pouch and a file folder. "Morning, all. Sorry about the weather. Mitch, we're going to need to—" Raymond stopped dead in the doorway of the dining room. His eyes darted from me to the blue folder, and finally to Sylvia. The grin vanished from his face so fast it looked painful. "Sylvia," he muttered, his posture stiffening. "I didn't know you were involved in this." "Neither did I, Raymond," Sylvia said, leaning back in her chair. "Not until yesterday, when I took a look at the trust agreement you drafted for Mitchell and Warren. I must say I was surprised. I didn't think a lawyer with 30 years of practice would present a client's wife with a document that strips her of her inheritance without once advising her to seek independent counsel, especially when that lawyer is a close personal friend of her husband." Raymond's face went pale. He set his briefcase down on the sideboard, his hands trembling slightly. "Now, Sylvia, let's not get ahead of ourselves. This is a standard estate planning tool. It's designed to protect the assets from probate. It's designed to strip Lorraine of her title and give Mitchell and Warren the power to put her in a care home against her will," Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a hard, dangerous whisper. "I've already spoken to Dr. Evans this morning, Raymond. I asked him if he had ever signed an evaluation suggesting Lorraine was suffering from cognitive decline. Do you know what he said?" The room was entirely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "He said he had never signed any such thing," Sylvia continued. "In fact, he was quite disturbed to hear that someone was representing to a title company that Lorraine was unfit to manage her own affairs. If you attempt to notarize this document today, Raymond, I will have a formal complaint for elder exploitation and conflict of interest delivered to the State Bar Ethics Committee before lunch. I'm sure you'd enjoy explaining this to the board." Raymond looked at Mitchell, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Mitch, you told me she was on board with this. You told me she wanted to do this." "She did!" Mitchell yelled, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She's just being spiteful. She's trying to ruin Warren's life. She's trying to ruin everything." "I am protecting myself, Mitchell," I said. My voice was very quiet, but it seemed to fill the entire room. Something I should have started doing 30 years ago. Raymond didn't wait to hear more. He picked up his briefcase and his wet umbrella. "I'm out, Mitch. I told you this had to be clean. I'm not losing my license over your family squabbles." "Raymond, wait!" Warren called out, but Raymond was already down the hall. The front door slammed shut, the glass pane rattling in its frame. Warren turned on me, his eyes dark with a cold, venomous rage. "You think you're smart, don't you? You just ruined my house, Mom. You ruined Cheryl's future. We're going to have to pull our offer on the property because we don't have the down payment. Are you happy now? Do you feel powerful?" I looked at my son, the boy I had stayed up with through croup and ear infections, the boy whose university tuition I had paid for with double shifts and worn-out shoes. I looked at the stranger he had become, a man who saw his mother only as a transaction that had failed to clear. "No, Warren," I said softly, "I don't feel powerful. I just feel very, very tired." "We're leaving," Warren said, his voice shaking. "Cheryl and I are packing our things today. We're not staying under this roof for another night." "I think that's a very sensible decision," I said. Warren stared at me, waiting for me to beg, to apologize, to offer him the money from my credit union account just to keep him near. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. He spun on his heel and stormed up the stairs, his heavy steps shaking the plaster ceiling above us. Sylvia stood up, closing her briefcase with a sharp, satisfying snap. She looked down at Mitchell, who was sitting on the bottom step of the stairs, his head in his hands, looking utterly defeated. "I'll bill you for the hour, Mitchell," Sylvia said dryly. She turned to me, her expression softening into a look of quiet, respectful solidarity. "Call me tomorrow, Lorraine. Let's start working on the partition of the marital assets. You have a lot of catching up to do." "Thank you, Sylvia," I said. I escorted her to the door. As she drove away through the sleet, I looked up at the second-floor windows. I could hear the sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor, the sharp, muffled arguments of Warren and Cheryl as they packed away the life they had tried to build on my ruins. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee. The house was cold, but for the first time in my life, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt like space. The sound of packing tape being pulled from a dispenser has a sharp, tearing quality that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. From the kitchen window, I watched Warren and Cheryl load their cars. The sleet had turned into a heavy, freezing rain, coating the black asphalt of the driveway in a glassy sheet of ice. Warren carried a blue plastic storage tote, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't have his hood up. He looked small, wet, and thoroughly defeated. Cheryl followed behind him, holding a garbage bag full of winter coats, her designer boots slipping slightly on the slick driveway. She didn't look back at the house. I stood by the screen door, my hands folded over my apron. It was a habit of 30 years, standing at the door to wave them off, to make sure they had their travel mugs of coffee, to remind them to check their tire pressure. As Warren walked past the porch for the last load, he paused. He looked at me through the screen door. His face was pale, his nose red from the cold. "I hope you're happy, Mom," he said, his voice flat, stripped of its earlier anger, leaving only a bitter, hollow residue. "You've got the house all to yourself now. I hope these empty rooms are worth losing your family over." "I didn't lose you, Warren," I said, my voice quiet against the sound of the rain. "You walked away because I refused to let you sell the ground I was standing on." He stared at me for a beat, his mouth twitching, as if he wanted to find some devastating final word. But there was nothing left to say. He turned, tossed the last bag into the trunk of his sedan, and slammed it shut. Cheryl got into the passenger seat without a glance. They drove down the driveway, their red taillights bleeding into the gray, misty afternoon, until they disappeared around the bend of Ridgeview Drive. Children who are raised on a mother's sacrifice rarely see her as a person. They see her as a natural resource. And when a natural resource suddenly stops yielding, they don't blame themselves for overmining. They blame the land for going barren. They don't think about the decades of nourishment they took. They only notice the day the well runs dry. I closed the heavy oak door and turned back into the hallway. The house felt larger now and cold. In the living room, Mitchell was sitting in his leather armchair. The television was off. The room was dark, save for the dull gray light filtering through the lace curtains. He was staring at the empty fireplace, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't look at me when I walked by. He was using the silence as a weapon, a familiar punishment he had used throughout our marriage whenever I stepped out of the narrow margins he had drawn for me. But the silence didn't hurt anymore. It felt like a protective barrier. I walked past him and entered the study. I turned on the small desk lamp, its green glass shade casting a warm, concentrated glow over the oak roll-top desk. I needed to gather my own documents, the deed to the house, my tax returns, the paperwork Sylvia would need to begin the partition of our assets. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. It was where Mitchell kept his personal financial folders. He had never locked it. He had never felt the need to. For 35 years, he knew I respected his privacy, and he had used that respect as a shield to hide his mistakes. I pulled out a thick black accordion folder labeled Personal/Confidential. Inside, beneath tax forms from 5 years ago, I found a series of bank statements from an account I had never seen before. It was a sole account in Mitchell's name at a regional bank 2 counties over. I sat down in the swivel chair and began to read. Every month for the past 2 years, a transfer of $1,500 had been made from our joint household account into this private one. But it was what happened to the money after it landed that made my breath catch in my throat. There were monthly payments of $1,200 to an entity called Lakeside Meadows, LLC. I pulled out my phone and searched the name. My fingers were cold, my skin suddenly numb. Lakeside Meadows was a brand new luxury retirement village overlooking the lake, about 40 miles west of here. It wasn't an assisted living facility like Shady Pines. It was an active adult community with a golf course, a clubhouse, and private, maintenance-free cottages. I scrolled through the PDF statements in the folder. Beneath the monthly payments was a signed contract dated 14 months ago. It was a lease-to-purchase agreement for a 2-bedroom cottage with a lake view. The buyer was listed as Mitchell Vance, single. The date of the final balloon payment, the payment required to secure the deed, was April 15th of next year, the exact same month Warren had scheduled the listing of my house. I stared at the word single printed on the legal document. He hadn't just been planning to sell my house to help Warren and Natalie. He had been planning to leave me. He was going to use the equity from my father's home to buy himself a luxury retirement by the lake, while he tucked me away in a 1-bedroom assisted living unit at Shady Pines under the guise of looking out for my health. He had already built his new life. He was just waiting for my signature to pay for it. The leather of the chair creaked. I looked up. Mitchell was standing in the doorway of the study. The green light of the desk lamp caught the sharp, defensive angle of his shoulders, but his face was in shadow. He looked down at the documents in my hands, then at the open black accordion folder on the desk. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The silence between us stretched, thin and fragile as ice on a winter puddle, waiting for the first heavy step to break it. "You shouldn't be going through my files, Lorraine," Mitchell said. His voice lacked the booming authority he usually summoned when he was angry. It sounded thin, dry, and raspy, like dead leaves scraping across concrete. I didn't look up from the page. I ran my thumb over the embossed silver logo of Lakeside Meadows. I wasn't looking for secrets, Mitchell, but it's hard to ignore a $40,000 deposit paid from our joint savings account, especially when the contract lists you as a single man. Mitchell stepped into the study, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He reached out as if to take the document from my hand, but I placed my palm flat over the page, anchoring it to the desk. He stopped, his hand hovering in the green light of the lamp before dropping slowly to his side. "It's a tax structure," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the dark window. "Raymond explained it to me. Because this house is solely in your name from your father's inheritance, we had to list me separately for the lakeside property to avoid the double taxation on the secondary residence. It's just legal jargon, Lorraine. It doesn't mean anything." "And Shady Pines?" I asked, finally looking up at him. "Was that a tax structure too? Sending me 3 hours away to a room that smells of industrial bleach while you move into a lakefront cottage with a golf course?" Mitchell's jaw worked silently. He didn't have an answer. "A man who plans his departure in secret has already divorced you in his mind years before he ever packs his bags. You are just the landlord he is trying to shortchange on his way out." He had sat across from me at the dinner table for 14 months, eating the meals I cooked, letting me wash his clothes, all while knowing that his future didn't have room for me. "Lorraine, look at me," he said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading tone I had never heard from him before. "I'm 65. My back is shot. My knees are gone. I can't keep up with this place. I wanted a fresh start, A place where I don't have to worry about the roof or the lawn. You could have had that here, I said softly. We could have sold this place together. We could have bought a small townhouse in town. But you didn't want a partner to grow old with, Mitchell. You wanted a housekeeper to leave behind when you moved on to your next season. That's not true, he whispered, but he couldn't look me in the eye. Without my signature on the deed transfer, you can't close the sale on this house, I said, pointing to the financial ledger. And without that equity, you can't make the final balloon payment on April 15th, which means you lose your $40,000 deposit. Am I understanding the math correctly, Mitchell? Mitchell's face went pale. The cold reality of his financial ruin was finally staring him in the face. He had risked everything on my compliance. He had assumed that 35 years of quiet submission meant I would never have the courage to say no. "You'll ruin me," he breathed, his fists clenching at his sides. "If I lose that deposit, I have nothing left. The joint savings are dry, Lorraine. I put everything into that contract." "Then I suggest you call the leasing office at Lakeside Meadows and see if they have a cancellation policy," I said. I stood up, closed the black accordion folder, and slid it into my leather handbag. Mitchell didn't try to stop me. He stood frozen in the green light of the desk lamp, looking like a man who had just watched his own reflection shatter. I walked out of the study and went upstairs to my bedroom. I didn't sleep. I spent the night packing a single, medium-sized suitcase. I didn't take any of the silver or the good china or the antique quilts I had spent years washing by hand. I packed my clothes, my personal photographs, my father's old leather-bound journal, and my original copy of the 2012 promissory note. The things that belonged to me and only to me. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the sky was a pale, bruised violet. The rain had stopped, leaving the driveway covered in a thin, dangerous sheet of black ice. I carried my suitcase down the stairs. Mitchell was sitting at the kitchen table. He was still wearing his clothes from yesterday. An empty mug of coffee sat in front of him, and the kitchen was freezing. He hadn't turned the heat up, as if he were trying to punish himself, or me, with the cold. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Sylvia has helped me lease a small apartment in town," I said, setting my suitcase by the door. "It's above the old bakery on Main Street. It has steam heat and a view of the park." "You're just going to leave me here?" he asked, looking up at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "In this drafty old place? By myself?" "This is your home, Mitchell," I said, "for now. But you'll have to learn how to clean the gutters yourself, and you'll need to figure out how to pay the property taxes in the spring. My salary from the school district is no longer going into our joint account. I stopped the direct deposit yesterday afternoon." Mitchell stared at me, his mouth opening slightly. He looked suddenly fragile, like an old oak tree whose root system had quietly rotted away beneath the soil without anyone noticing until the first strong wind came. "I don't know how to do this, Lorraine," he whispered. "I know," I said, "but you have 14 months to figure it out." I picked up my suitcase, walked out the front door, and locked it behind me. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of wet pine and cold earth. I walked carefully down the icy steps to my sedan, placed my suitcase in the trunk, and got into the driver's seat. As I backed down the driveway, I looked up at the house. It looked smaller in the dim morning light, its gray siding stained with dampness, its windows dark and blank. For 35 years, I had believed that house was my anchor. I was wrong. It was just a heavy wooden box I had been carrying on my back, and I had finally decided to set it down. The apartment above the bakery on Main Street was small, but it was bright. Every morning at 5 o'clock, the scent of fresh cinnamon and rising yeast drifted up through the floorboards, a warm, reassuring presence in the quiet rooms. I had furnished the space with a few simple things Sylvia had helped me find at a local estate sale: a drop-leaf maple table, 2 sturdy chairs, and a small blue ceramic teapot that had a tiny chip on the spout. It was a beautiful teapot, the color of a summer sky just before dusk. Mitchell would have thrown it away because of the chip. I kept it because it still held the tea perfectly. When you spend decades catering to other people's tastes, your own preferences feel like a foreign language. You have to learn how to speak yourself again, syllable by syllable. For 35 years, my shopping lists had been dictated by Mitchell's high cholesterol and Warren's dislike of onions. Standing in the grocery aisle on my 3rd afternoon in the apartment, holding a single perfect pear and deciding to buy it simply because I wanted to eat it, felt like a small, quiet rebellion. I was sitting at the maple table drinking a cup of Earl Grey when the phone rang. It was the landline Sylvia had insisted I set up. "Mom?" Natalie's voice came through the receiver. She wasn't yelling this time, but her voice had a jagged, breathless quality that instantly put me on alert. "Yes, Natalie?" "I went to the house today," she said, her voice trembling. "I drove down to see Dad. Mom, it's awful. He hasn't washed a single dish since you left. There are flies in the kitchen, and he's just sitting in his armchair with a blanket over his shoulders. The house is freezing. He won't turn the heat up. He looks so small, Mom. He looks like he's dying." I took a slow breath, letting the warmth of the ceramic mug seep into my palms. "Your father is 65, Natalie. He is perfectly capable of turning the thermostat dial on the wall. He is also capable of running water over a plate." "How can you be so cold?" she cried, her voice cracking with a sudden, sharp anger. "He is your husband. You took vows, Mom, for better or for worse. You can't just pack a suitcase and pretend 35 years of marriage never happened because you're angry about some papers." "I am not angry, Natalie," I said, my voice remaining level, quiet. "I am done. There is a difference. Your father spent 14 months planning to put me in a care home 3 hours away so he could buy himself a luxury retirement with my father's money. He didn't think about his vows then. He didn't think about for better or for worse when he signed a lease contract as a single man." "He was desperate," Natalie pleaded, backtracking quickly. "He's still desperate. He told me today that if he doesn't get the money to Lakeside Meadows by the end of next month, he loses the $40,000. He said he has a way to get the money, Mom. He said he doesn't need your signature." My hand tightened around the receiver. "What do you mean he doesn't need my signature?" "He said he found the power of attorney you signed back in 2018, Natalie said, her voice dropping into a guilty whisper. "The one from when you had your gallbladder surgery. He said because it was a general power of attorney and it was notarized, he can use it to sign a reverse mortgage on the house. He's already talking to some private lender he found online. Mom, please, just call him. If you talk to him, maybe we can work something out." The room seemed to tilt slightly. In 2018, I had undergone emergency gallbladder surgery. There had been complications, a sudden spike in my blood pressure that had kept me in the intensive care unit for 3 days. Before the operation, Mitchell had brought a notary to my hospital bed, claiming we needed a general power of attorney so he could pay the household bills and manage the school district health insurance paperwork if I didn't make it off the table. I had signed it, too sick and exhausted to read the fine print. I had assumed the document expired once I was discharged. I had assumed it was a temporary medical measure. "Natalie, I have to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mom, wait!" I hung up the phone and immediately dialed Sylvia's office number. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that made it hard to breathe. "Sylvia," I said the moment she answered, "we have a problem." I quickly explained what Natalie had told me about the 2018 power of attorney. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid, dry clicking of Sylvia's computer keys. "Lorraine," Sylvia said, her voice tight, professional, and suddenly very grim. "A general power of attorney doesn't automatically expire when you get well. It remains valid until it is formally revoked in writing, and that revocation must be filed with the county recorder of deeds if it's being used for real estate transactions. Did you ever file a revocation?" "No," I whispered, my throat dry. "I didn't know I had to. I thought it was just for the hospital stay." "Give me 5 minutes," Sylvia said. "I'm logging into the county land registry database right now. I'm going to check the title history on the Ridgeview Drive property. Stay by the phone." "I'm here," I said. I sat in the quiet kitchen, the ticking of the clock on the wall sounding like a countdown. Below me, I could hear the muffled, cheerful sounds of the bakery, the bell above the door chiming as customers came and went, the smell of fresh bread mocking the cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. I had trusted him. For 35 years, I had trusted him with my life, with my father's legacy, with my children's futures. And he had kept that 6-year-old hospital document like a hidden weapon, waiting for the exact moment he needed to strike me down. The phone rang. I picked it up on the first ring. "Lorraine," Sylvia's voice was tense, stripped of its usual calm. "You need to come to my office right now. Bring your car keys and your copy of the 2012 promissory note." "What is it, Sylvia? What did you find?" "A preliminary deed transfer was filed with the county recorder's office yesterday afternoon," Sylvia said. "Using the 2018 power of attorney, Mitchell has transferred 50% of the Ridgeview Drive property into his sole name, and he has already executed a short-term, high-interest bridge loan against it for $60,000. The lender is a private equity firm out of the city. The interest rate is 24%. I held the receiver to my ear, but the room had gone completely silent. The bread didn't smell warm anymore. The teapot on the table looked very small and very blue and completely broken. "He's already spent the money, Lorraine," Sylvia said. "He wired the $40,000 to Lakeside Meadows this morning. We have to move now." Sylvia's office was located in a converted Victorian house 2 blocks from the courthouse. It was a space that smelled of lemon wax, old leather, and decades of legal files. Outside, the rain had started again, a steady gray drizzle that smeared the yellowed leaves against the window pane. Sylvia sat behind her mahogany desk, her reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair. She had 3 separate piles of documents laid out before her, each one flagged with bright blue sticky notes. "Sit down, Lorraine," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a hard professional edge. I sat in the green leather armchair, placing my handbag on my lap. My hands were cold, the skin across my knuckles feeling tight and fragile. "Tell me, Sylvia, don't sugarcoat it." He used the 2018 power of attorney to sign your name to a quitclaim deed, Sylvia said, tapping the first pile of papers. It transferred 50% of the Ridgeview Drive property to him. Legally, because the POA was general and durable, and because it was never revoked, the county recorder had no choice but to file it. It looks perfectly valid on its face. And the loan? The loan is where it gets predatory, Sylvia said, her eyes darkening. He went to a private lender called Apex Capital Partners. They specialize in short-term bridge loans for people with bad credit and high-value real estate. They gave him $60,000. The interest rate is 24%, with a balloon payment of $72,000 due in exactly 6 months. To secure the loan, Mitchell used the power of attorney again to pledge the entire property as collateral. I leaned back in the chair, the leather cold against my shoulders. So if he defaults on that loan in 6 months? Apex Capital forecloses, Sylvia said flatly. They take the house, all of it, your 50% and his 50%. They don't care about your inheritance, Lorraine. They only care about the paper Mitchell signed. When you are betrayed by someone who knows you intimately, the pain isn't a sharp blow. It's the realization that they used your own kindness as a map to find the exact place where you could be broken. Mitchell knew how much that house meant to me. He knew it was the last physical link I had to my father. And he had used a document I signed while lying in a hospital bed, struggling to breathe, to hand the keys to a private equity firm. Is there any way to fight the power of attorney? I asked. Yes, Sylvia said, leaning forward. We file an emergency petition for an injunction. We argue breach of fiduciary duty. A power of attorney requires the agent, Mitchell, to act in your best interest. Transferring your property to himself and taking out a high-interest predatory loan to pay for his own luxury retirement is a textbook violation of that duty. We can freeze the assets, but there's something else, Lorraine. She pulled a document from the second pile and slid it across the desk toward me. Look at the witness signature on the deed transfer, Sylvia said softly. I looked down at the page. The notary's stamp was clear and purple, but next to it was the witness line. The signature was written in a sharp, left-leaning slant. It was a handwriting I had corrected on middle school book reports. I had seen it on graduation cards and grocery lists. It was Warren's signature. My son had stood in that private lender's office, in a room that probably smelled of cheap cologne and desperation, and he had signed his name to confirm his mother's erasure. He had watched his father use a 6-year-old hospital document to steal the house his grandfather had built, knowing it would help him secure his own comfortable future. He knew, I whispered. The words felt heavy, like stones in my mouth. He knew, Sylvia confirmed. He was present for the transaction. In the eyes of the court, this makes him complicit in the breach of fiduciary duty. If we file this lawsuit, Lorraine, we are suing Mitchell and we are suing Warren. It will be public. It will be ugly. Your family will be dragged through the mud in the local papers. I stared at Warren's signature. I remembered the night he was born, the terrible 30-hour labor, and the first time they placed his tiny, wet body against my chest. I had promised him then, in a quiet hospital room smelling of antiseptic, that I would always protect him. I had kept that promise for 36 years, and this was the receipt. Some women spend their whole lives trying to keep the peace, Lorraine, Sylvia said, her voice gentler now. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine. But sometimes peace is just a slow, quiet suicide. You have to decide if you want to keep holding up a roof that's designed to crush you. I looked out the window. A gust of wind sent a flurry of wet leaves plastering against the glass, where they stuck for a moment before sliding down into the dark. "What about the 2012 promissory note?" I asked, my voice steadying. "The $60,000 Mitchell owes me." "We file it immediately as a prior debt," Sylvia said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp, professional satisfaction. "We attach a lien to Mitchell's 50% share of the property today. Since his debt to you predates the Apex Capital loan by 12 years, we can argue that your lien has priority over their mortgage. It will tie them up in court for years. Apex won't be able to foreclose easily if there's a prior unresolved estate debt attached to the title." "And Mitchell?" "It will trap him," Sylvia said. "He won't be able to sell his share, he won't be able to refinance, and he'll be legally responsible for the high-interest loan he can't pay. He'll lose the Lakeside Meadows deposit because the court will freeze the funds he wired. We'll claw it back as part of the fraudulent transaction." I reached into my handbag, pulled out my father's old leather-bound journal, and extracted the yellowed, folded piece of paper from 2012. I placed it on the desk next to the Apex Capital loan agreement. "Do it, Sylvia," I said. Sylvia didn't hesitate. She pulled a fresh pad of legal paper toward her and began writing, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet office. "I need your signature on the authorization to file," she said, sliding a form toward me. I picked up the pen. My hand was remarkably steady. I signed my name, Lorraine Vance, on the line. I didn't use the yellow arrow Warren had left on my kitchen counter. I didn't need anyone to show me where to sign my own life back into existence. "This is going to start a war, Lorraine," Sylvia said as she gathered the papers. "No, Sylvia," I said, standing up and buttoning my coat. "The war was started 6 years ago in a hospital room. I'm just finally showing up to the battle." The legal machinery, when set in motion by a woman like Sylvia Albright, moves with a terrifying, silent efficiency. By Wednesday afternoon, the temporary restraining order had been granted by a county judge. Mitchell's private bank account was frozen. The $40,000 he had wired to Lakeside Meadows was placed in a court-supervised escrow account, and a formal lis pendens, a pending lawsuit notice, was recorded against the title of the Ridgeview Drive property. The lock on the house was officially jammed. Mitchell could not sell, he could not borrow, and he could not run. I was sitting in my kitchen on Thursday evening watching the steam rise from my tea when the heavy wooden door to my apartment shook. It wasn't a knock. It was the frantic, heavy pounding of someone who believed they had the right to break the door down if it didn't open fast enough. I unlocked the deadbolt. Warren stood in the dim hallway. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and his winter coat was soaked through, smelling of damp wool and panic. He held the thick packet of legal papers in his hand, the blue court backing wrinkled and stained with water. "What is this, Mom?" he demanded, pushing past me into the small, warm kitchen. He threw the papers onto my neat maple table, right next to my sky blue teapot. "You're suing me? Your own son? For fraud?" I closed the door and turned around, leaning my back against it. I kept my hands folded in front of me. "I didn't sue you for fraud, Warren. I filed a petition for a breach of fiduciary duty against your father. You are named as a co-defendant because you chose to sign your name as a witness to a theft." "It wasn't theft," he yelled, his voice cracking, echoing off the low plaster ceiling. "Dad said the power of attorney was valid. He said you were just being stubborn because you wanted to punish him. He told me you had agreed to the transfer years ago." "And you didn't think to call me?" I asked. My voice was very soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through his shouting like a razor. "You didn't think to pick up the phone and ask the mother who raised you if she wanted to sign away her father's house and move to an assisted living facility?" Warren's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders rising and falling with his heavy, ragged breathing. He had no answer. He couldn't say the truth, that he hadn't called because he didn't want to hear the answer. He hadn't called because my silence was convenient for his bank account. When you finally stand up for yourself, the people who have been using you will always act as if your self-defense is an act of aggression. They will call you cruel for refusing to let them hurt you. They will play the victim because the resource they were planning to harvest has suddenly walked away. "Mom, you don't understand," Warren said, his voice dropping from anger into a desperate, pleading tone. He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched. "The bank, they saw the Liz pendants on the house. Because I'm named in the lawsuit, they've frozen my mortgage pre-approval for our new place. The seller is going to pull the contract tomorrow. Cheryl, she's at her mother's. She says she can't deal with this. She says if my family ruins our future, she's done." "Cheryl didn't mind my family when she thought my kitchen was going to pay for her new home, Warren," I said. "How can you be so selfish?" he hissed, his face flushing a dark, angry red again. "You're 63. You have your pension. You have your little apartment. Why do you need that big house? Why do you need to ruin my life just to keep a bunch of old lumber?" "It's not old lumber, Warren. It's my father's house. And it is the only security I have left, because your father spent 35 years draining everything else." Warren dropped his head into his hands, sliding down onto one of the maple chairs. He looked suddenly young and very broken. "He lied to me," Warren whispered, his fingers twisting in his wet hair. "Dad told me he was going to put $50,000 of the bridge loan into an escrow account for my down payment. He said it was my inheritance early. But when I looked at the bank statements in the lawsuit, he didn't do that. He wired $40,000 to Lakeside Meadows, and the other $20,000 he paid off some private debt. He didn't leave a dime for me. He used my signature to get his own money and left me legally responsible for the fraud." I looked at my firstborn. The realization that his father had grifted him, that Mitchell had used his son's greed to secure his own escape, was written in the hollow line of Warren's jaw. The rot in our family went deeper than I had ever imagined. Mitchell hadn't just betrayed me. He had taught our children that betrayal was a valid currency, and then he had spent it on them. "I'm sorry, Warren," I said, and for the first time I felt a genuine pang of sorrow in my chest. But it wasn't the sorrow of a mother who wanted to save him. It was the sorrow of a woman mourning the boy he used to be. "But I cannot save you from the choices you made with your father." Warren stood up slowly. He looked at the papers on the table, then at me. There was no anger left in his eyes, only a cold, empty realization. "You're really not going to help us?" he said. "I've been helping you for 36 years, Warren," I said, opening the door for him. "But today, I'm helping myself." He walked out into the dark hallway, his steps heavy and slow. I locked the deadbolt behind him, the metal click sounding like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I sat back down at the table. The tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I picked up my blue teapot and began to pour a fresh cup. 10 minutes later, the landline on the wall rang. I walked over and picked up the receiver. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "Lorraine?" Mitchell's voice came through the line. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound desperate. His voice was cold, flat, and dangerously quiet. The voice of a man who had reached the end of his rope and decided he didn't care who he pulled down with him. "You've ruined the boy. You've ruined Warren. But you're not going to win this, Lorraine. I'm not going down alone. If you don't drop this lawsuit by Monday morning, I'm going to tell the court about 2014. My hand froze on the receiver. The warmth of the kitchen seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. 2014 is buried, Mitchell, I whispered. "Nothing is buried, Lorraine," he said, and I could hear the faint, dry chuckle through the static. "Not when I have the receipts." The line went dead. The night of 2014 was a Tuesday in late October, very much like tonight. Natalie was 22 then, living in a damp third-floor studio apartment in the city, sinking into a dark chemical fog we had spent 3 years trying to pretend wasn't happening. Then came the phone call from the county hospital. An overdose. A mix of prescription pills and cheap gin that had nearly stopped her heart. The doctor said she needed a specialized dual diagnosis facility. There was a place 4 hours away, a clean, quiet clinic in the hills, but the cost was $9,000 a month. Our insurance through the school district refused the claim, citing a technicality. I had supposedly missed the open enrollment deadline to add Natalie back onto my family plan after she dropped out of college. I was a school administrative assistant. I had the keys to the district office. I had access to the mainframe database where the employee benefit files were kept. On a rainy Saturday night, while the school was dark and empty, I went into the office. I changed the enrollment date in the system, turning a late October submission into a mid-September one. Then I opened the physical filing cabinet, pulled out my original hand-signed application form, and replaced it with a backdated copy I had printed at home. It was insurance fraud, a felony. Mitchell had come with me that night. He had stood by the door of the administrative office, watching the dark hallway while I worked. At the time, I thought he was protecting me. I thought he was being a father, helping me save our daughter's life. But when we got back to the car, he had reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the original hand-signed form, the one I had just replaced. "I'll keep this," he had said, his voice quiet, slipping it into his glove compartment, "just in case we need to prove the dates later." I had trusted him. I had let him keep it because I couldn't imagine a world where my husband would use my desperate maternal crime as a weapon against me. When you are a mother, you do not think about the law when your child is drowning. You only think about the depth of the water. But some men do not help you carry your burdens out of kindness. They do it so they can measure the exact weight of the chains they intend to use against you later. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in Sylvia's office. The coffee in my paper cup was lukewarm, but I held on to it just for the heat. Sylvia listened to the story in silence. Her pen lay motionless on her yellow pad. When I finished, she took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Lorraine," she said, her voice dropping into a low, serious register. "The statute of limitations for insurance fraud in this state is 5 years. Since this happened in 2014, the criminal liability has expired. The state cannot prosecute you, and the insurance company cannot sue you for the recovery of the funds." I felt a brief, sharp surge of relief, but Sylvia's expression didn't change. "However," she continued, "the school district's retirement board is a different matter. Your pension is governed by a code of conduct. If Mitchell presents the original hand-signed document to the superintendent showing that you falsified school records while employed as an administrative assistant, they can void your retirement benefits under the moral turpitude clause. You could lose your pension, Lorraine, all 30 years of it." The room seemed to shrink. My pension was my only independent income. It was the money that paid the rent on my bright little apartment, the money that allowed me to buy my sky blue teapot and my fresh pears. Without it, I would be entirely destitute, forced to rely on state aid or the very children who had tried to sell my house. "He knows that," I whispered. "Of course he knows," Sylvia said, her face hardening. "It's a leverage play. He wants you to drop the lawsuit and the lien so he can close the sale on the house and keep his Lakeside Meadows deposit. He's willing to starve you to do it." "What do we do?" "If he has the physical document, the original form with your actual signature and the real date, his threat is real," Sylvia said, leaning forward. "But if he doesn't have it, it's just his word against yours. After 12 years without physical evidence, the school board won't touch an anonymous accusation. They don't want the legal headache." "Where would he keep it?" I asked, though as soon as the words left my mouth, I already knew the answer. Mitchell was a man of rigid habits. He didn't trust digital files, and he didn't trust safety deposit boxes. He always believed the banks were on the verge of collapsing. He kept his insurance policies in the house. In the basement of the Ridgeview Drive house, behind the old water heater, there was a loose foundation block. Behind it was a small green metal ammunition box Mitchell had kept from his time in the National Guard. It was where he kept his coin collection, his mother's silver rings, and the papers he didn't want the world to see. "He keeps it in the basement," I said, "in the ammo box." Sylvia looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her glasses. "Lorraine, you cannot legally break into the house, but you are still a co-owner on the title. You have not been legally excluded from the property by any court order." "I still have my key," I said. "If you go back there, you must be careful," Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "If Mitchell is there, do not enter. If he catches you, it could be dangerous. But if the house is empty—" "I'll find it," I said. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, I drove back to Ridgeview Drive. The sleet had stopped, but a thick gray fog had rolled in off the valley, swallowing the trees and the streetlights. I parked my sedan 2 blocks away, beneath the dripping branches of an old oak tree, and walked the rest of the way. The house looked dark and dead. There were no lights in the windows, and Mitchell's truck was gone from the driveway. My key felt heavy and cold in my gloved hand. I stepped onto the front porch, the wet floorboards creaking softly under my feet. I slid the key into the lock. The lock turned with a heavy, metallic click. I pushed the door open. The house smelled of stale grease, coal dust, and the damp, empty chill of a place that had stopped being a home. I stepped into the dark hallway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had lived in this house for 35 years, but as I walked toward the basement door, I felt like a thief in my own life. The stairs to the basement were steep, unpainted pine, and they creaked with a dry, hollow protest under my feet. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The single, dusty bulb at the bottom of the stairs would have cast a yellow glow through the small cellar windows, alerting the neighbors that someone was in the house. Instead, I used the flashlight on my phone, the narrow beam of white light cutting through the thick, cold darkness of the subterranean air. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny silver ghosts. I walked past the old washer and dryer. The metal bodies of the machines were cold and dull. I had spent thousands of hours in this damp space, standing on the concrete floor with a plastic laundry basket against my hip, washing mud out of Warren's soccer uniforms, grass stains out of Natalie's jeans, and the grease of the lumberyard out of Mitchell's flannel shirts. I had done it all without thinking, believing that my physical labor was the mortar that held the bricks of our family together. But the basement of a family home is where the truth eventually settles. It's where you put the things you can't throw away but can no longer bear to look at. It is the repository of forgotten promises and accumulated neglect. I reached the far corner of the basement where the gas water heater sat. The massive metal cylinder gave off a faint, rhythmic hum, a warm breath of air venting through the pipe above. I squeezed myself into the narrow gap between the water heater and the rough concrete foundation wall. The smell of rust, damp earth, and old copper was thick here. I reached my gloved hand behind the heater, my fingers searching the rough surface of the concrete blocks until they found the edge of the loose one. I pulled. The block slid out with a dry, scraping sound, releasing a small shower of sandy mortar. Behind it, in the dark cavity, sat the green metal ammunition box. I pulled it out. It was heavier than I remembered. I set it down on top of a nearby plastic storage bin, my flashlight beam focused on the rusted steel latch. I slid the heavy clasp upward. It released with a sharp metallic clack that seemed incredibly loud in the silent cellar. I opened the lid. The first thing I saw was a stack of yellowed, legal-sized envelopes. I sorted through them quickly. Near the middle of the stack, I found the white envelope labeled LV, benefit forms. I pulled out the folded sheet of paper. It was my hand-signed application from October 2014 with the original unfalsified date written in my own blue ink. Next to it was the photocopy of the backdated version I had substituted in the school database. I had it. The physical evidence of my crime, the only leverage Mitchell held over my pension, was in my hands. But as I went to close the box, my flashlight beam caught something else. It was an old black vinyl savings passbook tucked into the very bottom of the ammo can, beneath Mitchell's National Guard medals and a velvet pouch of silver coins. The name on the passbook was Mitchell Vance and Martha Vance, joint with survivorship. Martha was Mitchell's mother, who had passed away in the spring of 2008. I opened the passbook. In May 2008, following Martha's death, the account showed a closing balance of $185,420, which had been transferred into a sole certificate of deposit in Mitchell's name at a regional bank in Ohio. I stared at the numbers, the white light of my phone screen making them blur before my eyes. In 2012, Mitchell's logistics business had supposedly collapsed. He had come to me in tears, sitting at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, claiming that we were on the verge of bankruptcy. He said we would lose the house, that we wouldn't be able to pay Warren's final semester of college or Natalie's medical bills if I didn't lend him the $60,000 from my father's estate. I had given it to him. I had emptied my father's legacy, the money my father had worked 40 years in the quarry to save for me, to rescue my husband from a ruin that didn't exist. While I was working double shifts at the school district and wearing shoes with worn-through soles to save on expenses, Mitchell had nearly $200,000 sitting in an Ohio bank account, untouched and hidden. He hadn't used his mother's money to save his business. He had used my father's money, ensuring that I was left financially dependent on him, while his own safety net remained perfectly intact. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it made my knees weak. He hadn't just lied to me about his business. He had systematically extracted my resources to keep me small, to keep me bound to him by the fear of poverty. Suddenly, the soft, rhythmic hum of the water heater was drowned out by a heavy mechanical rumble from directly above my head. The automatic garage door was opening. A car engine idled outside, the headlights sweeping across the small, dirty cellar windows near the ceiling before the engine was cut. I froze, the flashlight beam in my hand trembling violently against the concrete wall. Mitchell was back. I heard the heavy thud of the garage-to-kitchen door opening, followed by the slow, dragging footsteps of my husband entering the house. The ceiling joists creaked above me as he walked across the linoleum, heading toward the living room. The only exit from the basement was the wooden staircase that led straight up into the kitchen hall, right past the living room door. I was trapped in the dark. I stood frozen in the pitch-black corner of the basement, my phone flashlight switched off, the screen dark. The air was cold, smelling of old concrete and the faint, sulphurous hint of natural gas from the water heater. Directly above me, Mitchell's footsteps were heavy and deliberate. I heard the creak of the floorboards in the kitchen, the scrape of a chair leg, and then the heavy clunk of his boots walking toward the living room. I couldn't go up the stairs. If I stepped onto that unpainted pine wood, the creak would betray me instantly. I looked toward the back wall of the basement. In the dim gray light filtering through the small cellar windows, I could see the outline of the old wooden bulkhead doors, the storm doors that led up to the backyard. I crept toward them, my feet sliding over the cold concrete, my fingers clutching the 2014 insurance form and the 2008 passbook inside my coat pocket. The bulkhead doors were secured from the inside by a heavy iron slide bolt and an old brass master lock padlock. My hands were shaking, but I reached into my pocket and found my key ring. In the dark, using only my fingertips, I searched for the small, notched key to the padlock. We hadn't opened these doors since we stored the garden hoses last autumn. I found the key. I slid it into the lock. It turned with a stiff, heavy click. I braced myself, holding the padlock in my palm so it wouldn't clang against the iron bar. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, I slid the rusted bolt back. Squeak! The sound was tiny, no louder than a mouse, but in the silence of the house, it felt like a gunshot. Upstairs, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I was certain Mitchell could hear it through the floorboards. I waited, my back pressed against the damp wooden steps of the bulkhead. 10 seconds passed. 20. 30. Finally, I heard the sound of the television click on upstairs, the low, muffled drone of the evening news. Mitchell had dismissed the noise. I pushed the heavy wooden bulkhead doors upward. They resisted for a second, heavy with the weight of wet leaves and rainwater, before they yielded. I slipped through the opening, climbing out into the cold, foggy night. The sharp, wet air hit my face like a slap, clearing the musty smell of the cellar from my lungs. I pulled the doors shut gently behind me, left the padlock open in the grass, and ran through the thick fog toward my car. When you have spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, the fear of confrontation is a physical weight. But when you realize you have nothing left to lose, the fear becomes something else, a clean, cold focus. By 7 o'clock, I was back in my warm apartment above the bakery. The radiator was hissing comfortably, and the smell of fresh rosemary bread from below felt like a protective shield. I laid the 2 documents on the maple table beneath the light of the pendant lamp. The 2014 backdated insurance form, the 2008 secret bank passbook. I called Sylvia at her home number. When she answered, her voice was tired, but she listened to my discovery without interrupting. "Lorraine," Sylvia said, and I could hear the sudden, sharp intake of her breath. "This passbook is the smoking gun. If Mitchell hid an active account with over $180,000 in it during your marriage, and then lied to you about his financial state to induce you to empty your father's inheritance, that is a massive, actionable fraud." "What does it mean for the divorce?" I asked. "It means his credibility is entirely gone," Sylvia said. "In this state, a judge can award up to 100% of a hidden marital asset to the defrauded spouse as a penalty. Furthermore, the $60,000 he took from your father's estate is no longer just a personal loan. It's the proceeds of a fraudulent conversion. We can use this to wipe out his claim to any share of the Ridgeview Drive house. He won't just lose the Lakeside Meadows cottage, Lorraine. He'll lose everything. But we have to play this carefully, Sylvia warned. He still thinks he has the leverage over your pension. He's expecting you to drop the lawsuit by tomorrow morning. He doesn't know I have the documents, I said. Keep it that way until we enter the courtroom on Tuesday, Sylvia said. Don't answer his calls. Don't respond to his texts. Let him think he's winning until the moment we present the evidence to the judge. I understand, I said. I hung up the phone and sat at the table. I picked up my sky blue teapot and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea, letting the warm steam rise against my face. It was Sunday night. The deadline Mitchell had set, the Monday morning deadline, was less than 12 hours away. At 9:30, the landline on the wall rang. I didn't answer it. It rang 5 times before cutting out. 10 minutes later, my cell phone began to buzz against the wooden table. The screen showed Natalie's name. I hesitated, then slid my thumb across the screen. Hello, Natalie. Mom! Natalie's voice was high-pitched, frantic, and accompanied by the sound of wind and windshield wipers. She was driving. Mom, is Warren with you? No, Natalie. Why? Dad went back to the house tonight, Natalie cried, her voice breaking. He went to the basement to get something. He called me 10 minutes ago. Mom, he was screaming. He said you stole from him. He said you broke into his box and took his papers. He's completely out of his mind, Mom. He said he's driving to your apartment right now. He said he's going to make you pay for what you did. I am in a locked apartment, Natalie, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though a cold dread was already blooming in my chest. He has his spare truck keys, Mom. He's dangerous right now. He knows where the bakery is. Please lock your doors. Call the police. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I stood up slowly, setting the phone on the counter. The kitchen was very quiet. The radiator had stopped hissing, leaving only the dull, distant hum of the bakery's commercial ovens below. Then I heard it. Downstairs, the heavy glass street door to the bakery entrance clicked open. The bakery was closed on Sunday nights, but the street entrance to the second-floor apartments was always unlocked for the tenants. A second later, the heavy, dragging thud of boots began to ascend the wooden stairs. Creak, creak, creak. They were slow, deliberate steps, the steps of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he knew exactly where he was going. I walked over to the door. I checked the deadbolt. It was locked. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, listening as the footsteps reached the small landing outside my apartment. The footsteps stopped. Through the thin wood of the door, I could hear the sound of heavy, wet breathing. The brass doorknob jiggled, a sharp metallic rattle that vibrated through the thin wood of the apartment door. Then a heavy weight leaned against the frame, making the latch groan. "Lorraine?" Mitchell's voice came through the wood. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, gravelly whisper, thick with exhaustion and the sharp, sour edge of stale whiskey. "Open the door, Lorraine. I know you're in there." I didn't move. I stood 3 feet from the door, my hands folded across my chest, my breathing slow and shallow. "Go home, Mitchell. You have no business here." "You took my papers," he muttered, his forehead pressing against the wood, his voice muffled. "You broke into the house. You stole my property. You think you're smart? You think that lawyer of yours can protect you? I'm going to the school superintendent's house tonight. I'll show him the original 2014 form. I'll show him what you did. You'll lose your pension, Lorraine. You'll be begging for change on Main Street." A bully's anger is always loudest when he realizes his threats no longer have power. The silence of his victim is the one thing he cannot control. For 35 years, I had responded to his anger with apologies, with quiet compliance, with dinner plates and folded laundry. Tonight, I responded with the truth. "The superintendent won't care about a 12-year-old document, Mitchell," I said. My voice was very quiet, but in the narrow stairwell, it carried perfectly, especially not when the court is looking at this. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the photocopy of the 2008 bank passbook Sylvia had printed for me, and slid it through the narrow gap between the bottom of the door and the hardwood floor. The white paper slid onto the dark landing outside. "What is that?" Mitchell grunted. I heard the rustle of his coat as he bent down to pick it up. "It's the record of the joint savings account you kept with your mother," I said. "May 2008, $185,420. The money you transferred to an Ohio bank while you sat at my kitchen table and cried about bankruptcy." There was a long, heavy silence on the other side of the door. The rhythmic, wet sound of Mitchell's breathing suddenly stopped. How did you find this?" he whispered. His voice had lost its gravelly edge, replaced by a hollow, desperate rattle. "It was in the green ammunition box, Mitchell," I said, "right next to the medals you never earned." "Lorraine, listen to me," he stammered, his fingers clawing lightly at the wood of the door, like an animal trying to find a way out of a trap. "I don't have that money anymore. I swear to you, I didn't keep it. I lost it." "I don't care where it is, Mitchell," I said. "The court will care that you hid it. The court will care that you committed fraud against your wife to strip her of her father's inheritance." Some men believe their secrets are buried so deep they become part of the earth. They forget that the earth always shifts, and eventually the bones are exposed. "I lost it in the 2012 crash," Mitchell whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, pathetic sincerity. He leaned his forehead against the door again. "I invested in that land development scheme Warren's friend was running. It was all a scam, Lorraine. Every dime of my mother's money went down the drain. I was broke. I was so ashamed. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't let you know I had ruined my family's safety net. That's why I needed your father's $60,000. I was trying to cover the loss so the household bills wouldn't bounce. I was trying to save face." I stared at the closed door, the sheer pathetic vanity of it. He hadn't stolen my father's money because he was greedy. He had stolen it because he was too proud to admit he had failed. He had allowed me to wear shoes with holes in them, to work double shifts, and to live in a state of constant, suffocating financial anxiety, just so he wouldn't have to look me in the eye and say, "I made a mistake." "You let me believe we were going to lose the house, Mitchell," I said, my voice dropping into a hard, cold register. "You let me live in fear for 12 years, all to protect your pride." "I was trying to protect the family," he cried, his fist thudding weakly against the door. "I was trying to keep us afloat." "No, Mitchell," I said. "You were trying to keep yourself afloat, and you didn't care if you drowned me to do it." Before he could answer, a sudden flash of blue and red light swept across the kitchen ceiling, reflecting off the white cabinets. The distant rising wail of a siren grew louder, echoing off the brick buildings of Main Street. Natalie had called the local sheriff. Through the peephole, I saw Mitchell's face. The harsh, pulsing police lights caught the sudden, wild panic in his eyes. He looked down the stairs, then back at my door, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. He didn't wait for the deputies to reach the landing. He turned and ran down the stairs, his heavy boots clattering frantically against the wooden steps. I walked over to the kitchen window. Below, on the wet, glassy asphalt of Main Street, a county patrol car had pulled up, its lights painting the fog in brilliant shades of cobalt and crimson. 2 deputies stepped out, their flashlights drawing long white beams through the mist. They intercepted Mitchell as he burst through the bakery entrance. He didn't fight. He stood there on the sidewalk, his hands raised, looking small and thoroughly broken under the harsh glare of the flashlights. I watched as they spoke to him, his shoulders slumping as they escorted him toward the patrol car. My cell phone began to buzz against the counter. I picked it up, expecting Natalie, but the screen showed Sylvia's name. "Lorraine," Sylvia said the moment I answered. Her voice was incredibly tense, stripped of its usual professional calm. "I just got an emergency email from Apex Capital's legal department." "What is it, Sylvia?" I asked, my eyes still fixed on the blue lights below. "They've initiated an accelerated foreclosure proceeding," Sylvia said. "Mitchell missed the first interest payment on the bridge loan last Friday. Because of the default clause in the contract, Apex has the right to bypass the 6-month grace period. They are petitioning the court to auction the Ridgeview Drive house in 14 days. The phone in my hand felt suddenly very heavy. Mitchell hadn't just put the house at risk. He had already pulled the pin on the grenade. "Loan to own," Sylvia said, her voice flat over the phone as the flashing blue lights of the sheriff's car faded from my kitchen walls. "That's what firms like Apex Capital do, Lorraine. They don't want the $60,000 back. They want a $400,000 house for a fraction of its value. They structured the contract with an immediate acceleration clause. The moment Mitchell missed the first interest payment by 24 hours, they had the right to file for foreclosure." I stood by the window, the apartment suddenly cold as the radiator hissed its final wheezing breath for the night. "Can they do that if the property is under a lis pendens?" "They can try," Sylvia said. "They'll argue that their mortgage interest was secured before we filed our lawsuit. If the judge agrees, the auction goes through. We have to prove the mortgage itself was invalid from the beginning. We need to show that Apex knew or should have known that Mitchell was acting in bad faith." "How do we do that?" "I'm working on it," Sylvia said. "Get some sleep, Lorraine. Tomorrow morning at 9, my office. We're going to look at the loan origination files." I didn't sleep. I sat in my rocking chair, watching the fog press against the glass like a gray shroud. Predators do not set traps in the hope that you will escape. They build them with the precise knowledge of your desperation, waiting for the moment you stop struggling so they can tighten the wire. Mitchell and Warren had walked into Apex's office with their pockets empty and their eyes fixed on a future they couldn't afford, and the lenders had handed them a pen, knowing exactly how this story would end. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, Sylvia's office was quiet. The only sound was the low, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the rustle of papers as Sylvia organized a fresh stack of legal documents. My daughter Natalie was on the speakerphone on Sylvia's desk. Her voice was cracked, wet with tears and the raw, breathless exhaustion of someone who had spent the night awake. "The sheriff let Dad go this morning," Natalie sobbed, her voice hollow through the speaker. "They didn't charge him. They said it was a domestic dispute, and since he didn't physically touch you, they just held him until he sobered up." "But, Mom, he's a ghost. He's sitting in his truck in the driveway of the house. He won't go inside. And Warren..." "Cheryl is packing her things. She's leaving him. If this foreclosure goes through, we're all ruined. My consolidation loan is dead. Warren's credit is gone. Please, Mom, there has to be a way to stop this." Sylvia reached out and tapped the speaker button, cutting Natalie off. She looked across the desk at me, her eyes grave behind her silver-rimmed glasses. "Natalie is right about one thing," Sylvia said. "If the foreclosure goes through, the house is gone. But I've been looking at the title insurance documents Apex filed to secure the mortgage. To issue a loan on a property where a wife has sole title, the lender's title insurance company always requires a specific document: a spousal consent and waiver of homestead rights." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and slid it across the mahogany desk toward me. "A power of attorney cannot be used to sign a homestead waiver in this state," Sylvia explained. "The law is very strict about that. The title company refused to accept Mitchell's signature under the 2018 POA. They required your physical signature, Lorraine, witnessed and notarized." I looked down at the document. The page was titled "Waiver of Homestead Rights and Spousal Consent." At the bottom of the page, on the line marked "Lorraine Vance, Owner," was a signature. It was written in a neat, flowing cursive that looked remarkably like mine. But I had never seen this document. I had never been to Apex Capital's office. I had never signed my name to a waiver. "It's a forgery," I whispered. "We knew they would try that," Sylvia said. "But look at the notary stamp, Lorraine." I leaned closer, my eyes focusing on the small purple rectangle pressed into the paper next to the signature. The stamp read, "Cheryl Vance, Notary Public, State of Ohio." My daughter-in-law. Cheryl, who worked as an administrative assistant for a high-end real estate firm in town, was a licensed notary public. To secure the down payment for her new house, she had notarized a forged signature of my name on a document that stripped me of my homestead rights. She had used her state-issued stamp to certify that I had physically appeared before her, produced identification, and signed away my father's house. The room seemed to spin slightly. A contract is just a polite way of describing a rope when two people are holding different ends of it. But I hadn't realized how many hands had been pulling on my end. My husband, my son, and now my daughter-in-law. They had all stood in that office, passing the pen between them, each one taking a turn to write my end. "Cheryl did this," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "If we present this to the judge tomorrow," Sylvia said, her voice dropping into a hard professional register, "the mortgage is void. The title insurance company will pull their coverage, Apex's loan will be declared unsecured, and the foreclosure will be stopped instantly. The house is saved, Lorraine." "But what happens to Cheryl?" I asked. Sylvia took off her glasses, her face solemn. "Notarizing a forged signature is a Class C felony, Lorraine. It carries a mandatory prison sentence and the immediate loss of her notary commission and her employment. She will be arrested. And since Warren was the witness who signed the deed transfer, he will be investigated as an accessory to the forgery. Their lives will be completely destroyed." The silence in the office was suffocating. I looked at the purple stamp. I thought of Cheryl, with her tight, polite smiles and her designer boots, her constant, anxious chatter about paint swatches and kitchen island dimensions. She had been so desperate to escape the life she had, so desperate to stand in a house that looked like a magazine, that she had been willing to commit a felony to pay for it. And now the key to her prison cell was sitting on Sylvia's desk. "If I don't use this," I said, "Apex takes the house in 14 days. "Yes," Sylvia said. "If you protect Cheryl, you lose your father's home. You have to decide, Lorraine. Do you save your son's wife, or do you save yourself?" I leaned back in the green leather chair, my eyes staring up at the white plaster ceiling. For 35 years, I had been the shield that protected them from the consequences of their own choices. I had cleaned their messes, paid their debts, and smoothed over their cruelties, believing that my sacrifice was the only thing that kept us together. And now I was being asked to choose between my son's family and the ground my father had built for me. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a steady, relentless sound that seemed to mark the exact speed at which my life was being dismantled. "Lorraine?" Sylvia asked, her pen hovering over the legal pad. "What do you want to do?" "Call them, Sylvia," I said. My voice was very quiet, very flat. "Call Warren and Cheryl. Tell them to come to your office. Now." Sylvia didn't ask questions. She picked up her desk phone and dialed Warren's number. Her voice was cool, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion as she delivered the instruction. "Come to my office immediately. Bring Cheryl. We have the title insurance documents." While we waited, I sat by the window. For 35 years, I had believed that unconditional love meant infinite tolerance. I had believed that a mother's duty was to be the sponge that absorbed all the poison her family produced, so they could stay clean. But unconditional love is not a contract that requires you to participate in your own destruction. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step out of the way and let the consequences land on the people who built them. At 10:30, the heavy oak door of the office opened. Warren and Cheryl walked in. They looked exhausted, their eyes shadowed, their clothes slightly wrinkled. Cheryl was wearing a beautiful camel hair coat, but her hair was messy, and she didn't have her usual perfect makeup. Warren looked 10 years older, his shoulders stooped, his chin covered in gray stubble. They sat in the 2 leather chairs across from Sylvia's desk, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," Warren began, his voice raspy. "Look, we're glad you called. We want to find a compromise. We can work out a payment plan for the money Dad took. We can figure something out about the house. We don't need to go to court tomorrow. We're a family." "We are not here to negotiate a payment plan, Warren," Sylvia said, her voice cutting through his words like dry paper. She reached into the folder, pulled out the waiver of homestead rights and spousal consent, and slid it across the mahogany desk. It landed right in front of Cheryl. Cheryl looked down at the page. For a fraction of a second, she didn't move. Then her eyes landed on the purple notary stamp at the bottom of the page. Her hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from her face so quickly she looked gray, her skin turning the color of wet plaster under the fluorescent lights. She began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that made her camel hair coat rustle against the leather chair. "What is this?" Warren asked, leaning over to look at the paper. He blinked, his eyes scanning the page before landing on his wife's name. "Cheryl? What is this?" "This is a Class C felony, Warren," Sylvia said. "It is notary fraud, forgery, and the falsification of a state-certified record. It carries a mandatory 3 to 5 year state prison sentence. It also means the immediate, permanent loss of Cheryl's notary commission and her employment." I didn't think," Cheryl suddenly sobbed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. She clutched Warren's arm, her fingers digging into his coat sleeve. "Mitchell said it was fine. He said Lorraine had already agreed to it back in 2018. He said it was just a formality to get the loan through. Warren, please, tell them. I didn't know." "You knew I wasn't in that office, Cheryl," I said. My voice was very quiet, very steady. "You knew I hadn't produced identification. You knew I hadn't signed that page. You notarized a forged signature of my name because you wanted $60,000 for your new house." Cheryl looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, raw terror. She didn't have any polite smiles left. She didn't have any chatter about paint swatches. She was just a woman looking at the iron bars of her own prison. "People who commit crimes for luxury always believe their desires are a form of necessity," I said softly. "You thought my home was a sacrifice you were entitled to." "Mom, please," Warren begged, his voice cracking as he fell to his knees beside his wife's chair. He reached across the desk, his hands shaking. "Please don't do this. Don't ruin her. If she goes to jail, my life is over. Cheryl, she's my wife. Please." I looked at my son, the boy I had protected from the dark when he was 6. Now he was 36, and he was asking me to protect his wife from the consequences of a felony they had committed against me. "I am going to use this document to void the mortgage in court tomorrow morning, Warren," I said, "and when I do, the judge will have no choice but to refer the file to the district attorney's office. Unless—" I looked at Sylvia. She slid a second document across the desk. "Unless," Sylvia said, "Cheryl signs this immediate, unconditional confession, along with a formal surrender of her notary commission. And both of you must execute a total, irrevocable waiver of any and all claims to the Ridgeview Drive property, Mitchell's estate, and Lorraine's personal estate. You will also be legally responsible for my firm's legal fees. If you sign this today, we will ask the judge to seal the record of the forgery as part of a civil settlement, preventing it from being referred to the DA. It is the only option you have." Warren looked at Cheryl. Cheryl's head was down, her tears dripping onto the pristine camel hair of her coat. She didn't hesitate. She reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed Sylvia's pen, and signed her name on the confession. Warren signed next, his signature shaky and small. They stood up slowly. They didn't look at me. They looked like two people who had survived a shipwreck but had lost everything they owned in the water. They walked out of the office, the door closing behind them with a soft, final click. The room was very quiet. I sat back in my chair, feeling a strange, hollow space opening in my chest. I had saved my father's house. I had saved my pension. But the family I had spent 35 years trying to build was gone, reduced to signed confessions and legal waivers on a mahogany desk. Before I could speak, Sylvia's desk phone rang. She picked it up, her face neutral. "Sylvia Albright." She listened for a moment. Then her posture stiffened. She looked across the desk at me, the color slowly leaving her own face. "When?" Sylvia asked, her voice dropping into a low, serious register. "And the truck?" She hung up the phone. She sat in silence for a long moment, her hands clasped on top of the legal pad. "Lorraine," Sylvia said, her voice very quiet. "That was the sheriff's department. They found Mitchell's truck about an hour ago." "Where?" I asked, my heart pausing. "At the state park," Sylvia said, 40 miles west, by the lake, near the Lakeside Meadows development. The truck was parked near the water. The engine was still running, and the driver's side door was wide open. Mitchell wasn't inside. She paused, looking at me with a look of quiet, devastating pity. "They've launched a search of the water, Lorraine." The divers searched the black, freezing waters of the lake for 48 hours. They found nothing but thick silt, tangled weeds, and the cold, empty silence of the depths. But Mitchell was not in the lake. He was a man built entirely on vanity, and men of pride rarely have the stomach for the cold. The state police found him 3 days later at a Greyhound bus station in Toledo, Ohio. He was sitting on a plastic bench, wearing his brother Calvin's old hunting jacket, holding a duffel bag containing $12,000 in cash, the absolute last of his hidden resources. He had attempted to stage his own disappearance to escape the predatory lenders and the looming shadow of the forgery charges, hoping the water would wash away his debts. But the law is far more patient than desperation. Because Sylvia had filed the signed confessions from Warren and Cheryl, the court had officially declared the Apex Capital mortgage null and void due to fraud. Apex Capital was a firm of sharks. When they realized they could no longer seize my father's house, they turned their legal harpoons entirely toward Mitchell. They sued him for the full balance of the unsecured loan, and the state attorney followed with felony charges of bank fraud and grand larceny. Mitchell's luxury retirement by the lake was gone. Instead, he was assigned a state-appointed lawyer and a gray cell in a county holding facility, waiting for a trial he could not afford to fight. The fallout washed over the rest of the family like a slow tide. Cheryl's real estate license was permanently revoked, and she was placed on 5 years of supervised probation under the terms of our civil agreement. She and Warren were forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom rental apartment near the interstate, their dreams of suburban luxury evaporating into a stack of legal bills and court-ordered restitution payments. Warren took a night shift job loading freight at a local warehouse just to keep up with the interest on their debts. They no longer spoke to me, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the urge to bridge the silence. Natalie's frantic calls eventually stopped altogether once she realized the kitchen was closed and there was no mother left to absorb her financial storms. She was forced to finally grow up, taking a second job at a retail store to pay down the consolidation loan she had tried to secure with my displacement. A family built on sacrifice cannot survive when the sacrifice stops. It crumbles back into the separate, selfish pieces that composed it. I went back to the house on Ridgeview Drive one last time, not to stay. Sylvia had helped me list the property, and it had sold in 3 days to a young couple with a baby girl. The young husband had run his hand along the oak banister and smiled, telling me how much he appreciated the solid, honest foundation my father had poured. I stood in the middle of the empty dining room, where the gold-rimmed porcelain plates had once sat. The afternoon sun cast long, quiet rectangles of gold across the clean hardwood floor. The heavy, suffocating silence that had lived in these rooms for 35 years was gone. The house felt light. It felt clean. It felt like a building, not a cage. I walked into the kitchen, placed my ring of house keys on the counter next to the sink, and turned toward the door. I did not look back as I walked down the front steps into the crisp autumn air. I was heading back to my bright little apartment above the bakery, where my sky-blue teapot was waiting, and the air smelled of fresh rosemary and warm yeast. I spent decades holding everyone together until I finally realized nobody was holding me. In the end, the scales of life always find their balance. Karma does not arrive with a thunderous roar. It is the quiet, relentless settling of the earth beneath those who believed they could build their future on your ruins. If this journey of quiet strength, endurance, and ultimate reckoning moved you, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories, click the notification bell, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Walk with us through more deep psychological narratives where the silent finally find their voice and the scales of life are made beautifully even. Thank you for listening.